I think we need to get to the point where African nations, whereby you give away your culture, your attention, your genius, like Kabilame, for example, genius. You never saw a man who made so much money by keeping his mouth shut.
For a 23-year-old, he's not doing too. He's not too shabby.
That's for sure. But then, what are the odds that we are the ones at some point who are the pioneers of such projects?
True.
Well, I mean, to the point whereby maybe you don't get a fraction, but you own the thing.
I still stand by the fact that ownership. Listen, at the end of the day, yes, ownership will obviously, like you're saying, Michael Jordan will have royalties for time to come. I don't think we have that kind of mentality here. I don't think we're that forward thinking. And it's not an insult or anything like that. It's just at this point in time and the way the cultures and the way it's been inculcated is, I need money now. I need to put food on the table. I need to keep the lights on. To hell with IP, and all those kind of things. And how would he go about it in the first place anyway?
Well, that's the thing, because obviously now that you see how it works, that, why don't we have things that make money towards profit like the rest of the world does? For example, all of our African athletes are playing in the English Premier League. Heck, the entire French league is African, and you can pinpoint the heritage to a lot of Francophone African countries, making millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds for the Premiership every week.
But can you put an IP on a person?
Well,
can you put an IP on an idea?
You can put an IP on an idea and on a skill, which the world is doing today.
But you can mimic his skill. He shuts his mouth and does.
It's his.
So there's my 100 million views by just doing this.
And well done. I'll be seeing you after this.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that, have we not matured developmentally enough to the point whereby we say
I remember
we
at some
can
point
earn something?
You had a figure. So what would you sell out for?
981 million. 981 million perhaps. But it doesn't take... Well done. It doesn't take away from the inherent desire to say,
true,
in order for us to really move the needle, we must be able to create. We must be able to own.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge.
Hi, I'm Njoroge.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack people, power, policies, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's a perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here.
The folks who came up with intellectual property, for your information,
yes,
a lot of the folks who are making a lot of the big bucks today, right? We partake in it, and we're happy to walk away with a fraction of what we could actually earn. And perhaps that's the problem that we suffer from.
But do you want to then try and do the IP thing and then leave nothing on the table?
Well, I'm going to go back
or walk away nothing from the table.
I get it, but I'm going to go back to our leadership, and I say, you know what? You must create environments whereby such things are not just dreams,
so
but they can actually be reality.
It needs to start at the level of education when they are young and not vulnerable, young and impressionable, in the sense that, if you have ideas, teach them at that young age. IP is very critical.
Yeah.
We should have put an IP on cesarean sections.
Because it was us.
Yes,
and lobotomies.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That one I've not heard before.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears. Military. I think we're going to look at two different stories with regards to military. But to your homeland.
Yep. So the US in northern Nigeria, and it's talking about force, of course. The past 2 weeks, the United States has confirmed a small troop presence in northern Nigeria. Of course, we're looking at the states of Sokoto, whereby we saw the movement around Christmas last year. It's under the United States Africa Command. It's this, outfit. It's not a press conference deployment. It's small targeted advisory, and it's intelligence driven to say this is what you must do in this instance, and this is why it matters, to let people know this is what you should do. It comes, of course, after those airstrikes. It's aimed at operating across the north and spilling, towards the Sahel. But the signal here is subtle, but it's important. There has to be on-ground management of some of these things by the United States, and it's very clear in this. Otherwise, they would be managing it from Washington, and they're saying, no, we want to actually be there.
My question is...
You're going to have to ask the question, sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So, I like to ask this question because it's very critical. What's in it for me?
That's the question. That's the thing. If a Nigeria did not have, bundles and bundles of oil reserve or other resources, would there be a visit by the would there even be an outfit called the United States Africa Command?
Well, yeah. Fragmentation, I suppose Nigeria would be the lower hanging fruit when you look at in the context of people like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger as well. And like you said, the wealth aspect in terms of the oil does make a lot of sense.
It sure does.
So there was a deal that was cut somewhere in a government office somewhere, I'm sure.
Somebody said, come along and go ahead and do this. So no more invasions, because you can actually target a missile from Washington to Abuja or to northern Nigeria into Sokoto, which is exactly how it happened in December. But now they're saying, let's be on the ground, because me talking on the phone with you, Waweru, and me being in front of you having a conversation over lunch is significantly different.
True.
And the likelihood of you taking whatever I'm selling that day increases by our proximity to one another. So here, the likelihood of troops' boots on Nigerian soil by the Americans making a statement in one direction or another is likely to be swallowed whole.
So I'm assuming that if you look at presence more than actual, I mean, it doesn't have to be, it is a show of force, but like you said, it's soft. It means like, okay, fine, Big Brother's watching, we're here.
Yeah.
If anything kicks off, I got your back.
Indeed.
Well, for lack of a better geopolitical way of putting it. So apologies. And more apologies and more apologies.
No, don't mention.
No, sorry. Not to you.
Okay.
I'm talking about one Mr. Mhozi. It's interesting how the dynamic of how social media can become a political tool. All right. He tukanaed the US, saying that they were harboring, what's his name?
Bobby Wine.
All right. And then he had to retract he had to delete his ex comments and then apologize. I'm just wondering, is that the way the world is going?
Well, let me tell you, if you got somebody by the short and curlies, at some point, they're going to do what you want. And that if you make a statement about something and then realizing that, hang on a minute, this could get me in a spot of trouble if I don't retract, then you've got to go ahead and retract. But interestingly, being asked to apologize for the second time,
yes,
Kaine Rugaba has asked questions now and said, what am I apologizing for, actually? So the real persona of this man has come out in the second round of this. And it's going to be interesting because he's taking his battles to X and is asking now the question, what am I actually apologizing for?
Yeah.
So perhaps the true intention or the true spirit of this man has actually come out now.
But so it's all about ego at the end of the day.
100%.
So he said it fine. He retracted it and said, okay, fine. This is diplomatically, this looks, kosher. And then asked to apologize again. What you're saying is that he said,
for what?
For who? About what?
Why?
About who? Why? I maybe I'm old school. Telexes, and those kind of things. Communiques.
Right. Dove and a feather, I don't know.
Whatever, smoke signals, right? I don't think X is a place to actually air your dirty laundry.
But how
especially from these are continents, these are countries. If it's me and you having a tete-a-tete or a bit of a dispute, yeah, I can say, dude did this to me, etc., etc., and I abuse you and what have you. This is somebody who's being primed, and this is from somebody from, a lineage who's been primed, allegedly, to become the next ruler of Uganda.
And I don't think that he does these things in any kind of ignorance whatsoever.
You reckon it's deliberate?
Absolutely.
How now?
Oh, come on. Who's going to let somebody who you think may be a bit unstable here and there run amok?
A bit unstable?
Run amok with the kinds of things that he's saying that are a potential threat to things like national security. Do you think his father is unaware of the things that he's doing?
Does his father know how to use X? Let's start there. Number two, I don't think, given the way he's reacted to the second request for an apology, I don't think he has a social media manager to start with, because he looks like he just shot from the hip.
Well, his brain to mouth, well, in this case, brain to X filter, doesn't seem to be working very well.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's like they say, listen to somebody when they're a bit inebriated, and you will know that's what they mean. In this case, it seems to be a constant state for General Kaine Rugaba, because he's telling you exactly what he thinks. He can say whatever he wants.
No filters.
No filters.
But he obviously thinks he can get away with it.
Which I think what he's saying beyond getting away with it is that the sovereignty of states must be respected,
Okay.
even by the almighty American.
Moving on to our next security story. The darlings of East Africa.
Okay, here we go.
Kenya.
No less.
Right. This was a joint military training exercise that was held down to the coast. Yes, Mombasa. United States, UK, Australia, France. One all big happy family. And obviously, this is talking about maritime security. It's also looking at counterterrorism measures within the within the East African region, and interoperability. And there's conversations we've had around that on panel 54. What are we gearing up for? Pirates of the Caribbean or Pirates of the Indian Ocean? Look at me. I'm the captain now.
Let me tell you. And I think it all ties in together with the other story that we looked at in terms of what's happening in Uganda and also what's happening in Nigeria with, the American boots on the ground intervention, is that, and I've always said that just like we saw the Cold War being fought outside of Europe, we are going to see a global conflict that is going to be fought on the African continent. And whether it's going to be overt in terms of its expression or subtle, like what we are seeing now, it'll be fought either way. That military exercises between the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia and France happening in one country at once means something, that the allies are regrouping and they're going to use friends in on a continent that is seen and said to be the next resource frontier.
And there's a resource aspect that we're going to look at shortly, but I'm thinking out loud and engage mouth with that thing, open mouth insert foot here. But right, you talked about, and it triggered thought, you were talking about the show of, well, the physical aspects in terms of, yes, we do know there's still terrorist outfits that exist and what have you. And this might be a flexing of muscle to say, listen, again, fanya mambo kind of thing. But I think for me, I was looking in more the economic war that is not yet been brought to light. We know China is invading with soft power from an economic perspective. And they're now trying to make inroads in terms of things like bases in Djibouti and things like that. Is that now, would you then put the two together? Would I have to then separate and say, forget the economic war?
No, I don't think so.
And focus on this kind of aspect.
The next world conflict is going to be a resource conflict. It will be an economic conflict. There's no difference. It's just that now that the guns and the bombs are money.
I think that's where I was coming to. I think the military aspect is, obviously, it has a bearing, but the bigger picture for me is probably the economic war.
For sure.
For
sure.
Yeah.
And everybody's flexing their muscle in the meantime. Let's be friends of this person. Kenya will be, for all intents and purposes, an economic and military anchor for East Africa and the Horn. And that's why those lines are being laid right now. It would be nice to imagine it, but it's not because suddenly everybody's taking a shine to Kenya. Everybody's in for themselves. That's the truth.
I'm just wondering whether then also will give the powers that be or the Western states the ability to say, listen, we need to see some, and what happened, like and I'm talking specifically Kenya here though, 1990 multi-party democracy.
Right.
Can they come along with strings attached and say, listen, if you want us to continue these military exercises and look like we are, then there are certain concessions you'll have to make.
As they should. And that anybody who's worth their salt in any kind of geopolitical atmosphere at this point is not having those conversations is the three blind mice all over again. What are you doing? That you are not having these conversations then is a direct indicator of what you really think that you're doing developmentally.
We need to unpack this. Actually, there's a lot to unpack from that perspective.
Absolutely.
Right. Morocco.
So that was fun.
Yeah, Her Majesty the Queen, Her Majesty the King baby. They threw the toys out of the pram.
Yeah.
All right. They refused to host the AFCON Women's Cup final, which has been moved to South Africa. And this is all to do with what had just concluded Africa Cup of Nations, which apparently left some people a bit disgruntled.
They're out of the pram. They're on the floor. And they're squealing about, and the mother is watching this child on the floor of the mall and wondering, what is wrong with you? can you get up and behave properly? Because you cannot throw a tantrum for something that if it had been in the other direction, you would scoff at the folks who were making noise over a loss. You would.
And it puts a bad light on Africa.
It puts a very bad light on Africa.
And it also talks about the aspect of CAF and our footballing and sports bodies don't seem to be able to rein in their own members or whatever you want to call it. And what's the chip on their shoulder?
I don't know. We can get into some very, very messy regional political conversations here about certain regions of Africa and who believes that they're the better deal because of their proximity to Europe. We can have that conversation, or we can just say that I'm very glad that the folks decided to move the tournament so that you can understand that we can still keep moving. And we can. You're
not the end all and be all.
Absolutely, we can keep it moving, and we will have the. If you decide that you don't want to play ball, literally.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah. You can keep it. We can keep it moving, and you can sit in the corner and keep having your tantrum. We're gone.
Well, Morocco is going to be giving South Africa the evil eye.
It's okay. Yes. They'll be fine.
Speaking of South Africa, so mining in Daba and Africa's leveraging moment, actually. So next week, Mining in Daba opens in Cape Town. And this is not just a conference. It is actually a negotiation room. And this is, of course, about assets, strategic assets, more than anything else. And that would speak, obviously, to aspects of things like cobalt, anything to do with lithium, anything rare earths. So we're now, I think, as a continent, we're at the position where we can actually negotiate, or at least.
Do you think we are in the position where we can negotiate, or are we in the position where we must negotiate because we're left with the resources? And the thing about conversations is like this is that when I'm talking about Kabelame, I can say one thing and then I can talk about South Africa and say another thing. Those things can still remain true.
Yeah.
In the case that you see that this development index will not move further at the moment with the kind of leadership we have. So then you must negotiate, because if you cannot take your raw earth, you cannot take your cobalt, manufacture it and turn it into something else. If you cannot take your cocoa, if you cannot take your diamonds and do something with it, then you must be in a position whereby you say, you can come in and do what we cannot do. But in the meantime, this is what you must do for us. I think it's probably time the African nations negotiate at that level, because we've shown for the last 60 years that we are not able to handle the manufacturing that would bring us profits.
Can't organize a piss up in a brewery.
Come on.
And this speaks to, again, Nigeria. Masses of loads of oil, export to import.
Yes.
Right? But that is political.
That's highly political.
Right.
Because people have made, it's the same
invariably,
thing.
like what you're saying, it's about leadership. Everything seems to be pegged. We cannot negotiate if we have political machinations that look at ensuring the elite get their cake and eat it too.
Absolutely.
And they're not looking at a national level. They're not looking at a continent level. They're saying, how do I need money for the next elections.
Absolutely.
So I will feign negotiation. Behind the scenes, I've done what you call wag the dog or run a racket.
Yeah.
Front end of the store is showing that you're selling fruits and vegetables. The back end, you're selling hardcore liquor,
exactly.
Kind of thing. But also, are we in a position to actually negotiate?
I think we are, and I think we downplay that position. We
that's what I want to know.
Realize what a powerful position we actually are to negotiate. Because you can actually say, you know what, we're going to shut this down. What are you going to do? Short of Trump going into Venezuela and kidnapping the guy, what are you going to do? Are you going to kidnap 52 African presidents? What are you going to do? If you say that we are not going to allow this unless we negotiate, and that's what I'm saying, we must negotiate. But I think the time has passed to should we? No, we must, because we've realized some other things don't work. Well, it's either that or you take everybody like Jerry Rawlings did and put them in the square and shoot everybody. Oh. Start the thing from the beginning.
There's a phrase I like to use. We export raw materials and import refined disappointment.
We must negotiate, and that has to be the new model. Hey, there you go. Perhaps we should put it in a bottle and sell it. It's the new model for development in Africa. You must be negotiating, since you can't figure out how to use your resources to make you some money.
Oh, speaking of negotiations and speaking about where Africa is going and moving forward, let's get into our conversation today.
In this episode, we interrogate one of the most persistent political illusions of our time: the idea that elections automatically equal democracy. Across Africa, elections continue to happen. Ballots are cast and transitions are ritualized, yet accountability often disappears somewhere between the vote and the outcome.
Our guest is Professor Nic Cheeseman, one of the world's leading scholars on democracy, elections, and autocracy in Africa. His work asks an uncomfortable question. If elections no longer deliver power to citizens, what exactly are they doing?
Professor Cheeseman, thanks for joining us on Panel 54, looking at a number of issues today. But let's start off with the space that you occupy. It's a rare space, writing for academics, advising policymakers, and speaking directly to the public. You do that often. So that position gives you reach, but it also carries risk. Its simplification can clarify, but it can also distort. You speak to very many audiences what do most people fundamentally misunderstand about how power actually works in African politics?
To answer your question, because I like answering questions head on, I think the thing that most people misunderstand about African politics is about how political leadership works. I think there's a kind of understanding out there that if you're an ethnic big man and you show up at elections, that your ethnic community will turn up and vote for you. And yet anybody who's worked in African elections knows that that's not really true. You know, the people who are effective leaders, even if they're mobilizing on ethnicity, are often people who've invested great time and energy making connections to those communities. They're people who are often seen as being locally legitimate to those communities because they've delivered resources, because they've been accessible, because they've been local and they've been connected. And we've all seen leaders who are of the same ethnicity of supporters fall flat because they can't mobilize, they can't connect, there seems to be a project. A great example of this, I would say, is someone like Uhuru Kenyatta in Kenya. You know, people often forget that we go all the way back to 2002 and Uhuru's first presidential run, right? The big time when he was supposed to be taking over as president and following on in the footsteps of his father, was actually when he was picked to be the replacement for Daniel Arap Moi. Mm-hmm. And because he was picked to be Moi's replacement, and because the mood in the country was in favor of change, Kenyatta got humiliated in that election. He got destroyed by Moi Kibaki, and actually he wasn't able to translate his role or the fact that he was the son of the founding father into mobilizing his community. So people often have this understanding about ethnic politics, which I think is overly simplistic. And if you go to, most Kenyan counties or most Kenyan MP races, what you'll see is a lot of different leaders, often from the same communities, especially in rural areas, competing against each other, even in the primary or in the general election. So you can't win an election simply on ethnicity alone. You have to do all these other things. And we wrote this book called The Moral Economy of Elections in Africa to talk about, what is it that you need to do as a candidate to turn yourself into someone who seems to be legitimate.
So why do elections continue to exist even when they no longer change political outcomes?
I think the answer used to be, 20 maybe years ago, one of the answers was, there was intense international pressure. Perhaps holding elections made it easier to get foreign aid. Perhaps holding elections made it easier to become a member of the kind of representative elected leaders club. And we know that leaders, even authoritarians, crave that kind of respectability. They want to be seen to be following the rule of law, even if they're not. So 20 years ago, I think maybe that was the answer. I don't think that can be the answer anymore, because one of the things we see today very clearly is that the amount of foreign aid has collapsed. The significance of foreign aid, so the GDP of a country has collapsed. So again, we'll talk about a country like Nigeria or a country like Kenya. These countries' GDPs have been going up, the tax revenue take has been going up, aid has been going down. So the relevance of aid to the survival of those economies is much smaller than it would have been and is not really that significant to those governments. So I don't think those leaders are necessarily holding elections to please an international community. I think it's a couple of reasons. One, in the vast majority of countries in Africa, we know from lots of surveys from the Afrobarometer and others that citizens want elections. They want a say in the leaders that govern their lives. And so people know that getting rid of elections would be unpopular. I think the second thing is that getting rid of elections would be the one thing that would unite everything against a leader. A little bit like trying to remove presidential term limits. Let's imagine somewhere like Kenya right now, or somewhere like Zambia or Malawi. The one thing that would really galvanize everybody against the leaders of those countries would be to try and remove term limits or to remove elections, because that would signal, I'm going to be in power forever.
Right.
None of you are ever going to be president. None of you have got a chance. It's not only that we're going to manipulate the elections, but I'm not even going to give you a sniff of being able to get power. And that would unify people in the same way that people came together in those countries in the late 1980s against the one-party state. And it would create a mass mobilization that would actually potentially threaten those leaders and threaten to overthrow them. So I think one of the reasons that we still have elections in a lot of these countries is the citizens support them, but also that leaders are really afraid of galvanizing that cross-ethnic, cross-class support base for some kind of democracy and having that mobilized against them in that moment. In fact, what they probably know is it's much better to hold elections and rig them to stay in power than to not hold elections at all.
So when we look at the issues of accountability, where accountability in a lot of these areas has been neutralized, for the regimes who are in power, what is the purpose of an election if accountability has been neutralized? Going to some of the things that you've already stated?
Well, I think one of the things you get out of holding elections, right, is you can actually discipline your own party. So someone like Museveni, for example, gets a lot out of elections in that, you've got your MPs out there who have to campaign for you. You've got your candidates who actually have to go out there and campaign for your party. You can bring in more locally popular candidates. So keep in mind, and you know this already, but people often forget, right, that actually we have tremendous turnover in African elections, just not for the presidency. If you look at the parliament, you look at local level, you have tremendous turnover. There's countries you've had 40, 50% turnover in parliamentary elections. So we have a lot of turnover at the grassroots and at the parliamentary level. And that's really useful for a leader because it means your party can actually have more popular leaders locally. People get a sense of local control and local participation. It also means that all of those leaders are competing in a sense to show you how popular they are, so that you can then select them to move into parliament and to be in the cabinet and so on. So all of these things actually generate some benefits for leaders. Of course, there are also the costs. And one of the things that we've seen recently is that the costs have been quite high in terms of the repression that governments have had to use to contain dissent and complaints after elections. And I think one of the things that I would pitch right now is that we're seeing almost two contradictory trends smash into one another. One of those trends is, if we look at Tanzania, if we look at Uganda, elections are being more flagrantly rigged than before. It is more obvious that they are being manipulated. Look at Tanzania, where Tundu Lissu wasn't even allowed to stand, was in jail, some senior main political party banned from the elections. This is not careful, subtle manipulation. This is blatant, clear manipulation. So you've got that process, which is really directly undermining the credibility of the election. But then you've got the rise of perhaps more radical, more urbanized youth and others who are campaigning against that. And look at the Kenyan protests in 2024, explicitly not ethnic, explicitly not mobilized by one individual opposition leader, people trying to come together across ethnic lines to say, we want better from the government, we want less corruption, we want more accountability, we want, in that case, less taxation or the removal of the finance bill. These two things are going to clash against each other because that youthful protest movement that's starting to emerge in urban areas is going to explode when they see that level of electoral manipulation being done in that blatant way. One of the things I think the real source of potential instability moving forwards is more repressive, coercive, obviously sort of manipulative governments on the one hand, and this increasingly assertive demand for citizenship on the other.
We kind of already see it, don't we, Prof? And if the experience is clear, it's very clear what has been happening with the examples that you give. But survey data is also showing that increasingly young Africans are expressing skepticism about democracy, that perhaps this democracy that has been almost shoved down our throats can perhaps merge into something else. They still believe in rights, dignity and fairness, but the collapse is not necessarily about beliefs, but probably about belief in institutions. Is democracy actually failing in Africa, or is it a belief in democracy that's collapsing faster than the institutions themselves?
This is a really complex issue. My own personal take is that in a way, it's really remarkable how much support there is for democracy in Africa, given how badly it's performed in a lot of countries. We have a lot of governments that I think it would be fair to say have not really tried democracy. They've tried to manipulate the framework of democracy to actually run something else. And they've failed often to either give citizens proper civil liberties or genuine democracy. And if you look at some of the countries where we had coups, look at places like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, I think you could say that's what we had, right? These were not countries where civilian governments had genuinely delivered high quality democracy or development. So citizens had seen a government that claimed to be democratic failing on both of these grounds, in some cases eroding their own democratic legitimacy, for example, by postponing elections or manipulating elections, and then failing to actually provide security and support, jobs and economic growth. So in those places, it's remarkable in some ways that actually democracy retains some support and some credibility. My own sense is that one of the things that we're seeing is young people in particular, as you say, are becoming more willing to say that they would accept military rule. In particular, they often say that they would accept military rule if the government that's in power abuses its own position. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because people often cite this figure. 55% of people, I think, on the Afrobarometer might tolerate military intervention. High proportion of youth might tolerate military intervention in some countries. But they often forget the clause in that question to people, which is if the civilian government has abused its own position. And I think one of the things we're seeing in some countries is that people would tolerate the military intervention because they believe it's probably what's necessary to get rid of the system that's failing and build a new system. But if you then ask people, what do you want that new system to be? Not many of them say military rule. So the people who are saying, I would accept a military intervention, are often also saying, I would then want the military to give power back to a democratic government. Now, this varies. There are some countries in West Africa where people have done surveys and there seems to be much more appetite for the military junta to stay in power for longer. But in a lot of countries that have more of a democratic tradition, we actually see people saying, I would support military intervention, but I don't support military rule. So there's something there that's going on, I think, that's a little bit more nuanced. Right. But I think it makes perfect sense, right? These are citizens who are frustrated.
You mentioned a magic number. And I'm looking at the aspect of Paul Biya, Cameroon, 92 years old. Peter Mutharika, 85. Alassane is 83. Teodoro, Equatorial Guinea, 83. Emerson, Zimbabwe, 83. Waweru Museveni, Uganda, 81. So basically across Africa, there's been long-serving leaders increasingly clinging to power. Often they rewrite constitutions or manipulate succession rules. The danger may no longer be elections themselves, but what happens after entrenched leaders do exit, right? So is this persistence of aging presidents driven more by personal ambition or by institutions too weak to survive a basic leadership change?
Oh, that's another fantastic question. You guys are on fire today. I think the honest answer to that is that it varies. So I think there have been times when perhaps leaders have been willing to stand down and others around them have said, you can't do that because we can't hold on without you. So, for example, Peter Mutharika in Malawi, it was very clear, I think, to those of us who are watching Malawi, that there was a real risk that if Mutharika had stepped down, that his party would have fallen apart because it didn't have an obvious candidate to replace him. And the succession battle to replace him could have split the party. So that party was probably better placed going into the election with him as the head, even though he was the guy Malawians rejected in the last election, even though his previous government was seen to be corrupt and failing, because otherwise, if he went, they didn't have a way of replacing him. The stories, of course, if you go back to MDC and ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, that, after the election where the MDC obviously were going to win, and then the extreme violence was used by ZANU-PF, going back to 2008 now, that Mugabe might have been willing to consider stepping down, but part of the pressure on him to stay came from security forces and others who said, hang on, you can't go, because if you go, what happens to us? What we don't want to go, we don't want to have prosecutions. We don't want our wealth to be taken away. We don't want anti-corruption cases. We don't want to go to the ICC for the human rights violations. So I think there is an institutional component, but I also think we have to recognize that often we get leaders who are kind of in love with their own positions and start to believe their own rhetoric. Museveni is one of those, right? Museveni comes to power and tells us in one of his first speeches that leaders should not overstay.
Yes.
He is now a leader who has removed constitutional term limits and age limits to be able to stay in power. And one of the reasons, I think, is because he genuinely probably believes that he is the person that's delivered order for Uganda, going back to what we talked about a moment ago. He's delivered the stability. He sees opposition leaders, he sees Besigye, Bobby Wine, as a force for instability. So probably he's got so captured by that that he can't see that he's actually done everything he can do for the country. And the best thing he could do now is establish an orderly transition and allow people to have a change of government. Because what we now see, of course, is that under his government, people like Besigye are in jail, in terrible conditions, unable to speak to their lawyer, unable to speak to their doctor. Bobby Wine is on the run right now after the military invaded his compound during the last elections. Things that would have been, unacceptable and unthinkable are now happening because of his attempt to stay in power. But I think it's a really good insight from you that the problem in some ways is going to come when these leaders go. Because one of the things we know, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, is that if you die in office as a leader and you don't make it clear who's replacing you, you can then kick off essentially a civil war within your party that can be tremendously destabilizing. So Zambia is not a bad example, right? Michael Sata, untimely death in office. And all of a sudden, the Patriotic Front had to replace him. And there were two camps that split into two. They both held their party conventions. They both elected separate leaders. And it had to be the courts that actually came together to had to arbitrate who was going to be the next leader. So you can create that conflict within the party. Now, in the Zambian context, that was resolved relatively peacefully. But what will happen in Uganda if we see, for example, figures in the military who don't want Museveni's son to take over, people within the party who don't want Museveni's son to take over, Museveni's son who's clearly telling us on Twitter in his rants that he wants to take over. What happens if something incapacitates Museveni and all of these people are scrambling for the prize? Same question in Cameroon, right? Same question in Zimbabwe, where we have aging leaders who are getting older and getting less well. And there's a real risk in some of these countries that, unplanned, unmanaged succession processes after the person in power dies actually generate real instability and real problems for those ruling parties.
Let's look at a particular region in Africa, and that's the Horn. It's lived with war, famine, displacement, counter-terrorism for decades. We're looking at countries that have been embroiled in civil conflict for decades. What was once framed as a crisis increasingly looks like a permanent situation, a condition managed rather than resolved. Looking at Sudan, that with that conflict is easily the world's greatest in terms of numbers of people who have died. Humanitarian crisis, absolutely crazy. At what point does the international community admit that the Horn is no longer in crisis, but that it is actually managed instability? Systemic?
I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that we should say is that, of course, we have seen some significant changes in recent years. So we haven't just seen kind of continuity. If you think about the positive story, perhaps of the last 15, 20 years, one of those was Somaliland, and Somaliland establishing a functioning state and holding elections in which we've had transfers of power. There's a lot of limitations and challenges to the system in Somaliland, but one of the things that people often point to in the Horn is that it is possible in conditions like that to build something that's more stable. And as you say, we've seen Sudan, which has become an increasingly important crisis, and where the violence has got to incredible proportions. I mean, it was significant before, of course, in terms of Darfur, but what we see now is even greater. And as you say, one of the greatest, most significant crises and conflicts the world has. So I think it's important to recognize that those variations and fluctuations are happening within this. I think it is true to say that in some ways, we are beyond talking about crisis. I mean, if we think about somewhere like Ethiopia, on the one hand, you could say the Tigray conflict and the civil war around Tigray was a particular moment of crisis. But before that and after that, we've seen conflict and clashes either between communities or between sections of the society and the government in many different parts of Ethiopia outside of the Tigray region. So it's not just an isolated conflict, it's actually a process. I mean, this is the phrase that you use, right? Managed instability. There's a degree of that before and after the civil war, as there is in many of the other countries that we're talking about. So I think there's an element to that which is true. I think one of the challenges, of course, is the way that we use language is very politicized, and people often use the term crisis, not because they think what's happening is necessarily exceptional, but because it's a language that can suck in other people that might be able to help. Okay. And one of the things we know right now is that the international community is not paying attention. They are in Gaza, they are in Ukraine, they are in Venezuela, they are in Greenland. The mind of leaders who might historically have played a role in resolving these crises is divided in multiple ways. The troops that you might need to be peacekeeping troops to resolve something like what we're seeing in Sudan are all over the world playing many different roles. And there is a lack of leadership, especially amongst countries like the United States, which might historically have played a bigger role, to actually helping resolve these questions. So one of the things that I think is happening is that we're often seeing that language being used, but partly to try and remind people, actually there should be much more attention to Sudan than there is. It's an absolute scandal, the lack of attention that's happening to Sudan. But it's partly happening because Africa doesn't have the space in the world imagination that it had. I mean, it's always been marginalized. It's never been treated fairly in that sense. But since Ukraine, Gaza, the Donald Trump presidency, I think Africa's fallen further back, and the amount of attention and resources that can be mobilized to trying to deal with an issue like Sudan, I think has fallen. And that's a real crisis and tragedy, because as we know, one of the things that will happen as a result of situations like Sudan is that we will have negative kind of consequences, perhaps for countries nearby, for countries like South Sudan, for countries like Kenya, and so on. The impact of this in terms of refugee streams, in terms of armed flows, in terms of potential instability around border areas will not be kept within a country like Sudan. Or, for example, if Ethiopia was to tilt into another resumption of a border civil conflict, again, the consequences will not be just for Ethiopia, they will be for all of the countries and the borders. And so failure to actually engage seriously to stop some of these conflicts is actually having a really big regional effect, not just on the countries themselves.
But I guess sometimes it falls into the realm of what's in it for me. A lot of the time it's either extractive minerals and they'll say, okay, fine, we have a need, or we can do another We Are the World kind of concert, when it was about famine that people actually stood up and said, yes, we need to actually intervene. I want to shift gears slightly. I want to look at groups like Al-Shabaab, which has been on the tip of everybody's tongue, although it's not been as mentioned as much anymore. But they tend to survive overwhelming military pressure, right? So does this suggest terror is less, ideological? Or is it more rooted in governance failure and political economy?
I mean, this is not a topic on which I'm an expert. So staying true to what I said at the beginning of our chat, I should flag that this isn't something that I work on. But my sense is that it's always been both. And I would say terror has always been a combination of two things. There is often a driving ideology, and it's often ability to indoctrinate people into that helps to mobilize people. But it's also often a function of government weakness and failures, right? So, in failures in terms of job creation, failures in terms of giving people a sense of hope and belief in the country, failures of inclusion, as well as often security failures, right? Think about some of the biggest crises we've seen with terrorism in recent years. We know, for example, ahead of the Westgate scandal crisis in Kenya, there were a number of security failings that could have helped prevent that. There were also security failings in how that was dealt with by the security forces that could have minimized the impact. So I think the impact of terrorism in groups like Al-Shabaab is a function of all of these different things. I think one of the things that the Kenyan government seems to have done, for example, after Westgate, is get a better system of intelligence and intelligence sharing, get a better system of intelligence management through the county system. That's had some negative consequences. It's probably increased the government's capacity to coerce citizens who are not part of Al-Shabaab or not part of terrorist networks. But we haven't then had a repeat of those incidents in terms of a mass incident in Nairobi, in the way that we did with the Westgate incident. But that network of Al-Shabaab is still operating. It's still underground. We still see attacks in certain parts of the country, particularly at the coast, and so on, and the same in Somalia itself. So longer term, you need to have an effective state and an effective response in terms of the security forces. But if you actually want to stop the problem, rather than stopping the problem actually impacting on you, you need to go and do those other things, which is about education, state building, nation building, and all of those projects. And at the minute, one of the things that I think is worrying is that, of course, a lot of those projects are not being successful. Abiy is not achieving that in Ethiopia. Ruto is not achieving that in Kenya. And so that's one of the things that I think is a bit worrying, that are we going to see that one consequence of that frustration and demand for better government that I was talking about, and manipulation of elections, will that process push people to consider using violence because they see that they cannot change the government through peaceful means? And that's something that I worry about a lot, over the next 10 years.
Okay, so if African leaders are often blamed for these failures that you're talking about, either they are sanctioned for instability or pressure to reform. And so we thought, you talked about people reforming because of external pressures. But foreign actors are the ones who actually fund some of those militias, and they're the ones who do the extraction resources, and they do prop up authoritarian partners, although I'll call them puppets, or they actually shape conflict outcomes, and they frequently escape accountability. So power appears uneven even in moral judgment. So the question is this: is it hypocritical for external actors to blame African governments for instability while actively shaping the conditions that actually sustain it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we need to be better at is understanding those international linkages that you explained so well there. Of course, we need to hold people accountable. If people are taking key resources out of the Democratic Republic of Congo with no concern for the consequence of the way they're extracted on citizens, they are culpable in that, in the same way that the government of the country is. Absolutely. We've also seen the rise of a new set of countries in Africa that are not democratic themselves. Here I'm thinking about the authoritarian middle powers, Turkey, United Arab Emirates. A lot of these countries have their own agendas. Sometimes those agendas support reform in Africa, but sometimes they don't. And of course, you've got countries like Kenya now able to access, let's say, $1.5 billion of loan from the UAE. You've got the UAE operating as one of the big economic investors across East Africa, but also beyond in other areas of Africa. So you have a number of different actors engaging with Africa, some of which don't care about democracy, some of which say they care about democracy, but have historically failed to actually deliver on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are increasingly frustrated with the international community. So, we need to have a much more holistic understanding of the impact of all of these processes on African states. And we need to try and hold accountability much more broadly, including multinational companies and foreign governments.
Okay.
Now, again, it's really important to say that there's big variation here, right? There are some leaders who try and transform their countries much more. Think Julius Nyerere or Kenneth Kaunda, who really try and use their political parties to be the vanguard of a bigger change. And there are leaders like, say, Kenyatta in Kenya, who is more kind of wanting to keep the status quo, less wanting to mobilize the political party and so on. So there's big variations, but I think responsibility lies, in those two areas. I think they're probably deeply related. So probably we can't talk about one without the other, though, because some of what keeps some of those authoritarian leaders in power is the support they get from outside the country. And I think some of those leaders would perhaps be less repressive and less violent if they didn't have that support. So, in a sense, I think both need to happen at the same time. We need to have those international partners be more responsible and send different signals about what's acceptable. I think that would then encourage different behavior by leaders on the ground. Those two things probably need to happen at the same time in partnership. One probably won't happen without the other. So I think that's probably what we need. I think the challenge then is that the world is becoming increasingly complicated. So I talked a moment ago about the fact that we now have, countries like the UAE coming in and playing a bigger role. They're playing a massive role in Ethiopia, as well as in other places like Somalia. And of course, we've seen tensions around the role played by the UAE and the loyalty of different regions, including places like Somaliland. And one of the things that's happening is that picture has got more complicated over the last 10, 15 years. So if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about Turkey and drones to Prime Minister Abiy. We wouldn't have been talking about the UAE in the same way we are now. All of a sudden, to the traditional powers that we might have talked, and so neither of these two pieces is coming together in a way that it would require us, that we would need it to do in order to be able to build, a more stable, peaceful, democratic future.
A kind of a last question for you, Professor, is from what you've said so far and through this discussion, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the multiplicity of layers of problems, that are posed. But is there one way, is there one road at least that folks can get on if we're looking at solving inherent problems across the continent, fixing democracy, fixing systems of government? Is there a road that someone can at least take a step on to?
I think I'm an optimist. I'm a pessimist about the short term and an optimist about the long term, because I think that what we've seen in the last 2 years, if we're right about what we're seeing in places like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, is the emergence of citizens who are not willing to put up with some of the tactics and the poor performance of the past. And if that's what we're starting to see, then over time, that process will actually make it harder to deliver poor government, harder to persuade people to accept corruption, harder to get away with a lack of jobs and economic growth. And so one of the things that we might be seeing, and I hope we're seeing it, is that process of kind of urbanization, greater access to information, driving a new idea of what government should be, and that then putting increasing pressure on leaders. Now, the risk of that process is that, of course, we talked about this, it could end up with military takeovers because the military can take advantage of that dissatisfaction to take control. But it could also lead to processes of democratization. It can lead to governments being overthrown in democratic ways. It can lead to bad ruling parties losing power. Think about Gambia. We never thought that Jammeh would lose in Gambia, and yet Gambian citizens stood together to remove him. We didn't think that we'd see an opposition victory in Nigeria going back when the PDP was in power, but we did. Similarly, in the last election in Zambia, many people were concerned that the government would be able to manipulate the election to the extent that we wouldn't see an opposition victory. But people stood together in such numbers that actually the attempts to manipulate and control the process were futile. So I think what we can say is that actually there was a process of rising education, citizens increasingly frustrated with the situation, urbanization, and new demands, especially from younger people, for new forms of politics, that is going to be disruptive and destabilizing. And political elites are going to have a choice about how they play that. They can go down the repressive line, and we could see situations like West Africa and coups. But if they go down the reform line and actually meet those citizens halfway, we can see processes of democratization that build more accountable government. And one thing we know, if we look at the last 20, 30 years of Africa in aggregate and we look at the data, is that those democratic governments tend to be less disruptive, less corrupt, actually tend to deliver higher levels of economic growth and GDP than their authoritarian counterparts. So the countries that can divert onto that pathway, we can then actually see a positive cycle where greater democracy, greater accountability starts to drive lower corruption and greater economic opportunities. And that pathway, I think, is a pathway towards what you're talking about. That's the road we need to get on. The risk is if we divert down that military road and we get stuck in either military rule or in conflict between different factions, that will go backwards in terms of lower levels of economic growth, lower national infrastructure, greater division. And that's away from what I think are the goals of many people. But of course, as we talked about, that's a big simplification of what we're going to see in the next 20 years. And in reality, there are different pathways for each of the countries that we've talked about.
That was Ndu's final. I have a final question for you. We talked about Sudan, and we know statistically, I think the UN reported there's been 14 million people displaced as a result of the war in Sudan. Who actually benefits from these wars? I'm looking at it from the point of view where, how do humanitarian systems, for example, operate ethically in regions where war itself has become profitable to the elite or to external factors?
Yeah, we often ignore the extent to which war and conflict create economic opportunities. We see smuggling across the border by militaries and forces, which often enables people to get very rich from the war economy. We also see a process of different governments in neighboring countries investing in some of these conflicts in order to try and get control over territory or resources after the conflict. So if you go back to conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, people sometimes call these world wars or proxy wars because you would have 7 or 8 neighboring countries with troops or with proxy groups in the country actually fighting to get control of resources. In the case of Sudan, for example, we could talk about governments like the UAE, which is accused of actually supporting some of the forces in the conflict, including, the troops that have actually committed genocide, allegedly, and mass human rights violations, allegedly. And that they have done so because this is a regional game, because what they want is to boost the UAE's control over key areas in Africa, key territory, key access points, key strategic points economically in terms of access to water, access to ports. And they're investing in the conflict and helping the conflict to be sustained because they want to generate that benefit. If their guys win power, they then have that relationship and can use that control to outmaneuver other rival powers in the region. So all of this is actually sort of built into a really rich sort of economy of violence and an economy of future land control and resource control, and can't be understood, outside of that. And it's when you understand all of those different benefits, including to the elites who are leading the different factions, who themselves will be able to get rich to an extent from what they're doing, So when you understand all of that, you can also understand, how the conflicts continue for such a long time. That's not to say that it's all being driven by these considerations. There are many other factors going on, genuine human rights violations generating grievances among society, genuine desire by some people to establish a more stable form of government. But those incentives and those economic incentives are there, and they're one of the things that enable people to fight for longer, because they enable you to get access to weaponry, to access to higher impact weaponry, to keep buying ammunition and so on. That enables you to sustain the conflict beyond when it might have otherwise been able to be contained.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us on this.
This conversation reminds us that democracy does not always collapse loudly. Sometimes it survives as ritual. Elections continue, institutions function, but accountability quietly disappears.
We've explained how power adapts rather than retreats, how elections can stabilize control instead of challenging it, and how external actors often shape African outcomes while avoiding responsibility for the consequences.
The danger is not simply autocracy. It is the illusion that meaningful choice still exists when it does not.
You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If this episode made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it and keep the conversation going. Find us on your favorite streaming platform and on our social media at Panel 54 Pod.
Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, keep the lens clear. Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens.